Good day everybody, RC Grabbag here, welcome back to the channel. So in my last video I designed, built and installed a concrete arch bridge and blended it into the surrounding hardshell. In this video I'm going to show some more progress on the layout and we'll take a close-up look at an unusual set of HO scale brass Virginian EL-2B Electrics. But first I'm going to cover some topics that are probably long overdue and should help to answer some questions about the layout. I've gotten a number of questions about the layout size and the track plan, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to provide some information about the room itself, and then we're going to take a walk around the layout following the main line for an entire loop. And hopefully with that, you'll get a good idea of the mainline plan. And please hit me up with any questions if I missed something. Now before we get into it, let me cover a few important items. First, this layout is what would be considered an older design. This was intentional. It has scenes where trains will move through those areas more than once. It has some places that are difficult, not impossible, but difficult to reach. It does not follow any prototypes. It is a complete freelance layout. These choices were deliberate in order to meet the objectives that I wanted in my layout. That is, I wanted mountain railroading on a grand scale, something that would make what I consider a good use of the space. I didn't want a helix in my layout or multiple shelf levels to deal with elevation changes. I wanted these changes to occur organically. And this is not a criticism of those layout features. They serve a purpose and should be used if desired. It's not always one size fits all. So like any model railroad, mine has compromises, but they represent my choices for better or worse. As for those difficult to reach areas, they are free of complicated trackage, no turnouts or the like. So far these areas haven't been a problem except when it comes to scenery, but I consider it a small price to pay for the end result. I've seen many large layouts in my travels, and accessibility can be challenging, but I feel the results are worth it. Now, about the room itself. It's about 33 feet wide, and it's 44 feet long on one side and 53 feet on the other, which allows room for the stairwell. The aisleways are approximately 3 feet wide. The train platform itself is essentially a spiral winding around in a clockwise direction from outside to inside. If there's anything else I missed that you might want to know about, please drop a question in the comments. One last note for the tour, I won't be running a train because I'm rerouting a section of Mainline, so the Mainline is not completely traversable at this time. I also want to add some context as I walk around and point things out, so coordinating with the running train would be a bit complicated. Alright, so with that, let's start the tour. Here we're entering the train room from the second floor of our house, and it's one of two entrances, the other being directly from the garage. I've moved a little to the left down this aisle, and I'm heading to the spot where I typically would place a locomotive on the track to begin to run it. This will be our starting point. I'm swinging the camera around past some of the recent hardshell work and back towards the door I came through so we can orient ourselves somewhat before we start. I'm pointing to the door I came in and also take note of the stairwell to the left leading down to the garage foyer. And now back to our starting point, let's begin the journey. We're starting on this inside track and heading westbound into our first tunnel. We're heading around this bottommost bend, which will be completely covered in mountain scenery in the future, and eventually exiting the tunnel on the other side. From the other side now, still on the inside track, we exit the tunnel and continue on our way. We're going to curve around to the right and shoot through another future tunnel and come out on the other side, just about to cross the stone arch bridge. And we're going under the newer hardshell mountain. Back over to the other side of the mountain, we're going to cross the stone bridge, curve off to the right, and head down to the far end of the layout near the room's entrance. Just again reminding you what track we're on. Heading straight on down, we'll curve off to the right again as we enter the future urban setting of the layout. And I'll be tapping the track again from time to time so you know what route we're taking. So just continuing around, we're on the same track as these PFE reefers are sitting on. So we're on the second track from the inside. We curve around to the end of the peninsula here, and we're passing our starting point right over here. And we get to the opposite end near the room entrances again and curve off to the left. So now I have my back to the room entrances, and our journey continues on this second from the inside track around this curve. With some of the tracks diverging, our inside track now becomes the outside track as we move straight on down away from the room entrances. Down at the other end, our main line heads to the other side of the platform, straight towards the window in the background on the lowest level. Our main line has risen in elevation a little bit and is heading towards this temporary span, which will eventually make way for the scale lift bridge sitting alongside. We're curving off to the left here, and this long curve will eventually be a large steel trestle coming off of the lift bridge. And again, you can see we're starting to gain some elevation here as we pass over some lower level track that we were following earlier. And we're continuing upgrade towards this tunnel at the other end, and we're on the outside track. From the opposite end, we've traveled up this gentle grade, and we're going around another curve behind the large curved trestle, and again we're on the outside track. Completing the curve behind the trestle, we emerge from another tunnel and continue our climb to the highest point of the layout, which is the curved trestle we just passed. And at this point we're directly above our starting point near the base of the concrete arch bridge. We're still climbing as we go through this tunnel into the recent hardshell and emerge from the other side. As we continue on, we go under the Rock Island Bridge and up around this curve, which will turn us around and set us off back to the large curved trestle, which is the highest point on the layout. As we swing around this curve, we begin to head in the opposite direction and our main lines diverge once more. We have one of the main lines going across the Rock Island Bridge, and we have the line that we're on which crosses this temporary span on its way up to the curved trestle. Our line swings around the other side of this hardshell and continues upward. Our line still has a blue tape on it that was used to protect it from the wet plaster from the nearby hardshell scenery. Our line converges back together with the other main line, and we're now back on the inside track as we cross this straight wooden trestle on our way to the curved trestle. Now we've made it to the highest point, crossing the curved trestle on the inside track, and then we'll begin our descent. Our climb has resulted in an elevation change of around 2 feet. As we begin our descent, we'll cross the steel Diablo Canyon Bridge running parallel to the straight wooden trestle. We're still on the inside track heading towards the window back there and curving off to the right about a foot to the left of the hardshell mountain. As we cross the canyon bridge, we make a sweeping curve to the opposite direction and head back towards the other end of the layout for another pass through the future urban area. Our return to that area takes us through a gentle S-curve, crossing over some previously traveled mainline below it. Standing near the S-curve on the opposite side, we are still descending as we approach the other end of the layout. We're on this track closest to the edge as we travel. We continue straight, getting back to a lower elevation, and then curve around to the right once again to reverse direction. We're going to pass those same PFE reefers that we passed earlier, but this time we are on the outermost track. We make our way to the other end of this middle peninsula to once again reverse direction. As we swing around, we're passing our starting point right over there. These tracks to the lower right with all the trains sitting on them will be hidden staging, so they are not part of our mainline run. As we head on down back to the other end of the peninsula, we'll change direction yet again, and again our main lines will diverge somewhat, and we'll be heading into the area of a future classification yard and passenger station. We're still on the outside track, heading into this temporary storage area for buildings, which will eventually become the yard, and head back down to the opposite end of the room. We are getting close to the end of our journey as we exit the yard, across the benchwork to reverse direction for the last time before completing the loop. At this point, we're making one last turn to the left to return to our starting point. Ignore that piece of plywood laying across the track, it will be out of the way shortly. There's the piece of plywood again laying across the track, but imagine it's not there. We pass right through it and emerge from a tunnel on the other side. Our journey has finally come to an end and we are back to our starting point. We've covered approximately 600 feet of main line. The average trip by HO train takes about 15 to 20 minutes. We did it in about half the time, and hopefully with a little more context so you have a better idea of what's going on. That's it for the walk around tour, and I hope that gives you a better idea of what this project is all about. And if you have any more questions about the layout, please drop them in the comments below. And now, let's take a break and have a look at a unique offering from brass importer Global Outlet, the Virginian EL-2B Electrics. These are Virginian EL-2B Electrics in brass HO scale from importer Global Outlet. Global Outlet was not around for very long, but they did manage to produce a few models, and these electrics are one of their offerings. The pantographs, one of which is seen here, can be made functional to pick up power from overhead catenary wire if so desired. Paint and graphics are very well done, and each truck is individually sprung. Hope you enjoyed this look at these EL-2B Electrics. Now, let's get back to the layout with some new progress updates. I'm going to be working on creating a riverbed behind the stone arch bridge. The riverbed starts with a plywood sheet base in the approximate shape of what will eventually be the river itself. For the riverbed in this location, it will be wide at the edge of the bridge and quickly narrow to pass under the bridges behind it. I need to cut some of the temporary track risers to make room for the plywood, so I'm using a scrap piece of plywood to determine what needs to be cut away. Then I just take my oscillating tool with a cutting blade and remove the unneeded material. After the cuts are made, I'll remove the part of the riser that's attached to the benchwork. The remainder will rest on the riverbed once it's in place. So I'm taking some measurements which I will transfer onto a piece of plywood from my scrap heap and begin cutting the necessary shapes. Now comes a bit of a challenge in fitting the plywood under the existing risers. Unfortunately, the poor railings on this stone arch bridge got totally destroyed during these maneuvers, so they will have to be remade. Now I'm making these sort of wing pieces on each side, which will help blend in the future scenery. I made a mark on the underside to tell me where to make my cut. After the cut is made, I just set the piece in place. Now I'm just screwing everything down, and I'm using two drills, one of which has a 1/2 inch bit on it to make a shallow recess to countersink the wood screws. This is the wing piece going in on the other side. Finally, a little vacuuming to clean up the area. The next chunk of work was actually unplanned initially. What I'm going to do is reroute this part of the main line, and I'm doing this because I have these three nice timber truss bridges which I'd like to bring closer to the edge of the layout so they can be seen up close. I'm also going to join these bridges together to make one rigid assembly for easier handling. So it's back to the workshop, and I begin by cutting off the excess structure material on the ends of the bridges. With the ends cut off, I have a flush joint between the individual bridges. Now I'm ready to align the bridges precisely and glue them together. The brick is helping keep the bridges stable while I fuss with the alignment. You may have noticed the gap on the horizontal piece at the bottom. This was unavoidable, so I'll be filling that in and covering it with a tie plate so it won't be seen. All three sections have been joined now, and you'll notice I didn't cut the outside ends of the flanking bridges. This gives me some extra material to work with. Now you can see the bridges are essentially one piece and should be easier to handle when it comes to installing on the layout. Back up to the layout room, and I'm now removing the section of mainline that will be rerouted. First I cut the track and then free it from the sub roadbed. Once the track is free, I remove the screws holding down the plywood base. Unfortunately, the end of this plywood sub-road bed is glued, so I have to make a cut here and shave off the glued part. With the necessary cuts made at the other end of this mainline section, I can remove it and put it aside. I've shaped some of the replacement sections and am test fitting them in place. One trick I use to figure out these shapes is to use a piece of micro-engineering flex track which holds its shape when bent. This works as a basic templating tool which can then be used to mark the shape onto the plywood. Now I'm using a small piece of plywood to join the sections together with glue. I've made two of these sections to provide the approaches at either end of the truss bridges. So I now have the bridges temporarily in place, with one of the new approaches coming in from the right, so you can get an idea of how this is going to look. I still have a lot to do to make the bridges functional, so I'm going to end the video here and save the rest for next time. Hope you've enjoyed what you've seen. Next up is RC's grab bag of random stuff, and in this segment we'll be taking a look at another one of my occasional hobbies, a retro hobby in fact, and that's Super 8 filmmaking, and that's with actual film. So if you're interested, stick around, otherwise see you next time. Here we have two Super 8 movie cameras. The first one is the Canon 1014 XLS, which was introduced in 1979 and is loaded with features for the time, and is one of the first microprocessor controlled Super 8 cameras. The second camera here is another legendary one that started life as a Beaulieu, but has since thoroughly been refurbished and modernized by a company called Pro 8mm. Looking more closely at the Canon, it had a variety of features for the budding filmmaker. Automatic exposure, adjustable frame rates, effects like fade in, fade out, and lap dissolves, and a microprocessor-controlled intervalometer for time lapses. It also had a motor-driven zoom lens of about a 10:1 zoom ratio, and the lens also gave the camera macro and low light capability. The Canon could also record sound, although sound Super 8 film is no longer being manufactured. About the only feature this camera didn't have was autofocus. That was still a few years away. Switching over to the Beaulieu, aka rebadged with the Pro 8mm moniker, this camera is not quite as feature-rich as the Canon, but it has a fantastic lens and the whole thing is very robust and of high quality. Pro 8mm guts these, refurbishes them, and sets them up with a modern rechargeable battery installed in the detachable hand grip. Super 8 film is still available from Kodak, and pictured here are two long expired cartridges of Kodachrome, which is no longer made, and Ektachrome film, which is still being made. The Ektachrome cartridge is sound film, but it's long since expired. On both cameras, loading them with film was a simple matter of opening up a door and snapping the film cartridge in place. The sound film cartridge was slightly larger than the silent cartridge, and this was so that the film could be routed around the camera's sound recording head. The film itself had a thin magnetic strip bonded to the edge of the film, and it was on this strip that the sound was recorded. Now that you've seen some camera examples, I have some sample footage that I recently shot, so sit back and enjoy some nostalgic motion imagery. And if you want to see more, I have a Super 8 film playlist on my channel.